The sun painted the horizon with streaks of crimson and gold as Willow Fairchild stood at the edge of the Colorado frontier town, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the June evening in 1877. Behind her lay the charred remains of her parents' homestead, and ahead stretched nothing but uncertainty and miles of unforgiving terrain. She'd buried her mother and father just 3 days prior, victims of a fire that had consumed everything but the clothes on her back and her father's pocket watch. Willow clutched the timepiece in her palm, its familiar weight offering little comfort as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. At 22, she'd never imagined being so utterly alone. The townspeople of Silver Creek had offered condolences, but little else. Times were hard for everyone in these parts. "I've walked alone too long," she cried into the emptiness, her voice breaking as the vastness of her solitude engulfed her. "Not anymore. I'll walk beside you." The deep voice startled her, and Willow whirled around, nearly losing her footing on the rocky ground. A tall figure sat atop a chestnut stallion, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he dismounted and stepped closer, she could make out his features, weathered skin bronzed by the sun, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a face that bore the marks of a man who had seen his share of hardship. "Who are you?" Willow asked, instinctively taking a step back, her hand tightening around her father's watch. "Jackson Blackett," he replied, removing his hat respectfully. "Folks call me Jack. I was passing through when I saw the smoke from your homestead 3 days back. Helped the sheriff and some men try to save what we could, but—" His voice trailed off and genuine sorrow filled his eyes. Willow studied him cautiously. His clothes were trail-worn but clean faded denim pants, a simple cotton shirt, and a leather vest. A gun belt hung at his hip, but there was nothing threatening in his stance. If anything, he stood with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to spooking wild horses. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Blackett, but I'm quite capable of managing on my own." Her voice sounded stronger than she felt. Jack nodded, his expression serious. "No doubt you are, Miss Fairchild, Willow Fairchild, Miss Fairchild, but these lands aren't kind to lone travelers, especially as night falls." He gestured toward the darkening sky. "I'm heading to Fort Collins." "If you're traveling that way, I'd be honored to escort you. Safety in numbers and all." Willow hesitated. Everything she'd been taught warned against trusting strangers, especially in these lawless territories. But there was something honest in his eyes, and the prospect of facing the wilderness alone chilled her more than she cared to admit. "I have relatives in Denver," she said finally. "My aunt and uncle. I was planning to seek them out." Jack nodded. "Fort Collins is on the way. We could travel together that far at least." As if to emphasize the urgency of a decision, a distant howl echoed across the plains. "Wolves." Willow shivered involuntarily. "I don't have a horse," she admitted, embarrassment coloring her words. A small smile touched Jack's lips. "Fortunately, thunder here is strong enough for 2, at least until we reach the next town." He patted the chestnut's neck. "We can purchase you a mount there." "I haven't much money," Willow confessed. "We'll figure something out," Jack assured her. "For now, we should make camp before full dark. There's a creek about a mile ahead with good shelter." Willow looked back at the town one last time. There was nothing for her there now, only painful memories and uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Blackett. I accept your escort to Fort Collins." Jack extended his hand, helping her mount Thunder. As they rode away from Silver Creek, Willow couldn't help but feel that despite the tragedy that had befallen her, perhaps fate had not entirely abandoned her after all. The campfire crackled softly as Jack returned with 2 rabbits he'd snared. Willow had busied herself gathering kindling and setting up what little camp they could make with Jack's supplies. The small clearing by the creek offered good protection, with rocky outcroppings on one side and the water on the other. "You've done this before," Jack observed, noticing how efficiently she'd arranged their site. Willow nodded. "My father taught me. He believed everyone should know how to survive in the wilderness, even daughters." "Smart man," Jack replied, kneeling to prepare the rabbits. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. Most folks don't think to teach their girls such things. My father wasn't most folks. He came west when I was just a child, dreaming of building something lasting. Her voice grew soft. He nearly succeeded, too. Jack glanced up at her, understanding in his eyes. "What happened? If you don't mind my asking." Willow stared into the flames, finding it easier to speak of tragedy to this stranger than to the townspeople she'd known for years. "We don't know for certain. Mother and father were in town selling our crops. I'd stayed behind to tend to some mending when I saw the smoke." Her voice caught. "By the time I reached the homestead, the fire had consumed nearly everything. They must have returned while I was at the neighbor's." Jack remained silent, giving her the space to continue or not as she chose. "The sheriff thinks it might have been bandits," she added finally. "There's been trouble in these parts lately, desperate men looking for easy targets." "I'm sorry," Jack said simply, and somehow those two words carried more genuine sympathy than all the formal condolences she'd received in town. As they ate the simple meal, Willow studied her companion. Though clearly trail-hardened, there was a gentleness to him that contradicted his rugged appearance. His movements were deliberate, economical, like a man who knew the value of conserving energy. "What about you, Mr. Blackett? What brings you through these parts?" Jack took a moment before answering. "Work, mostly. I drive cattle when the ranches need an extra hand, track game when they don't. Lately, I've been scouting for the railroad." "A man of many talents," Willow observed. A small smile touched his lips. "Jack of all trades, master of none, as my pa used to say." "And where do you call home?" Something shifted in his expression. "Haven't called anywhere home for a spell. Been moving with the seasons since the war." "You fought?" He nodded once, offering no details, and Willow didn't press. 8 years had passed since the war's end, but for many the wounds remained fresh. As night descended fully, Jack unrolled his bedroll and insisted Willow take it while he kept watch. Too exhausted to argue, she accepted gratefully. As she drifted towards sleep, the sound of his quiet movements around the camp brought an unexpected comfort. For the first time since the fire, Willow slept without dreaming of flames. The following days fell into a rhythm as they traveled northwest toward Fort Collins. True to his word, Jack helped Willow acquire a sturdy gray mare in the next settlement they passed, negotiating a fair price with a widow eager to sell. Willow named her Pearl for the unusual light gray coloring of her coat. "She has spirit," Jack observed as Willow expertly guided the mare alongside Thunder. Like her owner, Willow smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the June sun. "My father always said spirit is what keeps you alive out here." They took to riding at dawn and dusk, resting during the hottest part of the day beneath whatever shade they could find. During these breaks, they shared stories, Jack of his travels across the territories, Willow of her life on the homestead. She found herself laughing at his dry humor, surprised that such a sound could still come from her after all that had happened. On the 4th evening, as they made camp by a small tributary of the South Platte River, Jack pulled something from his saddlebag. "Thought you might like this," he said, handing her a small leather-bound journal and pencil. "Noticed you eyeing it at the general store back in Greeley." Willow took the simple gift, touched by his thoughtfulness. "How did you know?" Jack shrugged, suddenly looking almost boyish despite his 30 years. "You mentioned your ma taught you letters. Figured you might want to put some thoughts down." That night, after Jack had taken first watch and Willow lay awake listening to the night sounds, she opened the journal and began to write. Not just about the tragedy, but about the unexpected journey she now found herself on, and the mysterious cowboy whose quiet strength had become her anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The next morning brought ominous clouds and the distant rumble of thunder. Jack frowned at the horizon as they packed their meager camp. Storms coming fast. We should find better shelter than what these plains offer. Willow followed his gaze to the darkening sky. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles north of here. My father traded with him occasionally." Jack nodded. "Lead the way." They rode hard, the wind picking up and bringing with it the scent of rain. By the time they reached the small log cabin nestled against a rocky hillside, the first heavy drops were beginning to fall. The trapper was long gone, moved further north, according to Willow's father's last account, but the sturdy structure remained. Inside, the cabin was dusty but sound, with a small stone fireplace and crude furnishings. Jack immediately set about checking for unwelcome animal residents, while Willow gathered what dry kindling she could before the deluge hit in earnest. Within minutes, the sky opened, and rain pounded against the cabin's roof with such force that conversation became difficult. Jack managed to start a small fire, its warm glow casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. "Looks like we'll be staying put for a while," he observed, watching as rivulets of water began streaming down the single window. Willow nodded, suddenly aware of how small the cabin felt with just the two of them inside. Over the past days, she'd grown accustomed to Jack's presence, even comfortable with it, but something about being confined together in this intimate space sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the way his storm gray eyes caught the firelight. They shared a simple meal of jerky and the last of their cornbread, conversation flowing easily between them despite the storm's constant background roar. As evening approached and the rain showed no signs of abating, Jack improvised separate sleeping areas, the small cot for Willow and a bedroll near the fire for himself. "We should reach Fort Collins in 2 days if this weather breaks," he said as he stoked the fire one last time. Willow felt an unexpected pang at his words. Fort Collins meant their paths would likely diverge, she continuing to Denver, he to whatever job awaited him next. The thought left a hollow feeling in her chest that she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "What will you do then?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jack considered for a moment. "There's work with a rancher outside town, could stay there through fall at least." "That sounds stable." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not exactly what folks expect from a drifting cowboy, is it?" "Is that what you want? Stability?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to voice. "Once, maybe," he finally answered. "After the war, I just needed to keep moving. Felt like staying still meant facing things I wasn't ready to face. And now?" Jack's eyes met hers across the small room, and something unspoken passed between them. "Now I'm starting to remember there might be reasons to stop running." The storm intensified overnight, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, brilliant flashes. Sometime in the darkest hours, Willow woke to find Jack standing by the window, his silhouette stark against the occasional brightness. Without thinking, she rose and moved to stand beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Storms like this, they take me back to places I'd rather forget." Willow didn't need him to elaborate. She'd heard enough stories of the war to understand how its echoes could haunt a man years later. Hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath her fingers tensed briefly, then relaxed. "When I was little and afraid of storms," she said, "my mother would tell me to count the seconds between lightning and thunder, said it would help me know how far away the danger was." A flash lit the room, and instinctively they both began counting. The thunder followed almost immediately, rattling the cabin's walls. "Not very reassuring," Jack observed, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "No," Willow agreed with a small laugh, "but I'm not afraid anymore." Jack turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. "What are you afraid of, Willow Fairchild?" The question caught her off guard. She could have deflected with a light response, but something in his gaze compelled honesty. "Being truly alone," she admitted. "Facing a future without the people I loved or the place I called home, starting over with nothing but memories and regrets. And now," Willow took a deep breath, "now I'm afraid of reaching Fort Collins." Understanding dawned in his eyes. Slowly, as if giving her every chance to step away, Jack raised his hand to her cheek. His palm was calloused but infinitely gentle as it cupped her face. "Willow," he whispered, her name on his lips sounding like a prayer. The next flash of lightning illuminated his features, completely the lines around his eyes, the small scar at the corner of his mouth, the honest openness of his expression. In that moment of perfect clarity, Willow made her decision. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question asked and answered in the span of a heartbeat. Then Jack's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened into something neither had expected to find on this journey. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I never planned for this," he confessed. "For you." "Nor I for you," Willow replied, "but here we are all the same." They remained by the window until the storm began to subside, talking in low voices about their pasts, their hopes, the unexpected turns that had brought them to this moment. By the time dawn broke, casting weak sunlight through dissipating clouds, something fundamental had shifted between them. The weather cleared enough by midday for them to continue their journey, though the muddy terrain slowed their progress considerably. They rode closer now, their mounts side by side, hands occasionally reaching across the space between them in small gestures of newfound intimacy. By sunset, they made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods, the atmosphere between them charged with unspoken possibilities. As they sat before the campfire, Jack finally broached the subject they'd been circling all day. "When we reach Fort Collins," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I was thinking I might accompany you to Denver if you'd want that." Willow's heart quickened. "I would, very much." Jack nodded, relief evident in his expression. "And after Denver?" "I don't know," Willow admitted. "My aunt and uncle have offered me a place with them, but, she met his gaze directly, "but I'm not certain that's the path I want anymore." Jack took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "What if there was another option? The rancher I mentioned, he's selling some land. Good land with water rights, nothing fancy but enough to start something." Willow's breath caught. "Jack, are you asking?" "I'm asking if you might consider starting over with me." He looked down at their joined hands. "I know it's fast. I know we've only just met, but I've learned to trust my instincts out here, and everything in me says you're someone worth building a life around." Tears pricked at Willow's eyes. "I've lost everything once already, the thought of risking my heart again." "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen," Jack said softly. "No one can, but I can promise you won't face it alone. Not anymore." His words echoed their first meeting, completing a circle neither had seen forming until this moment. Willow looked up at the stars emerging in the twilight sky, thinking of her parents and the dreams they'd had for her. "Yes," she said finally, turning back to him with a smile that held both vulnerability and determination. "Yes, I'll consider it, more than consider it." Jack's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He leaned forward to seal their understanding with a kiss that promised not just passion but partnership, a foundation strong enough to build a future upon. The remaining journey to Fort Collins passed in a blur of shared plans and growing certainty. They arrived on a clear July morning, the town bustling with activity as new settlers and established residents alike went about their business. Jack led them to a modest boarding house run by a widow he knew from previous visits. "Mrs. Holloway," he greeted the sturdy woman who met them at the door. "Got room for 2 weary travelers?" The woman's sharp eyes took in their travel-worn appearance and the way they stood close together. "2 rooms, I presume, Mr. Blackett?" "Of course," Jack replied smoothly, though Willow caught the flash of disappointment he quickly masked. Mrs. Holloway showed them to adjacent rooms on the 2nd floor, promising hot water for bathing would be brought up shortly. The moment they were alone in the hallway, Jack pulled Willow into a quick embrace. "Meet me downstairs for supper after you've rested," he murmured against her hair. "I'd like that," she replied, reluctantly stepping back as footsteps sounded on the stairs. Clean and dressed in her one spare dress, wrinkled but serviceable Willow descended to the boarding house's small dining room that evening. Jack was already waiting, freshly shaved and wearing a new shirt. The sight of him sent a pleasant flutter through her stomach. "You look beautiful," he said as she approached. Willow laughed softly. "I look like a woman who's been on the trail for over a week." "Beautiful," Jack insisted, pulling out her chair. Over a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, they discussed their plans. They would rest in Fort Collins for 2 days, during which Jack would speak to the rancher about the land. Then they would travel to Denver together to meet Willow's relatives. "I should tell them about us," Willow said, still finding it strange and wonderful that there was an us to discuss. "About our intentions." Jack nodded, a hint of nervousness crossing his features. "Will they approve, do you think?" "They want me to be happy and safe," Willow replied honestly. "If I tell them you make me both, they'll welcome you." The next morning, Jack rode out to meet with the rancher while Willow explored Fort Collins. The growing town showed signs of prosperity, new construction alongside established businesses, a school, churches, and the promise of the railroad's imminent arrival. She found herself lingering outside a small dress shop, admiring a blue calico in the window. The thought of starting fresh new home, new life, perhaps even a new dress brought both excitement and trepidation. Everything was happening so quickly, yet somehow it felt right, as if her life had been building toward this unexpected turn. When Jack returned that afternoon, his expression told her the news before he spoke. "He's agreed to sell," he said, excitement barely contained in his measured tone. 20 acres with good water access, a small cabin that needs work but is sound, and grazing land that joins the national forest. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Willow interrupted, throwing her arms around his neck, propriety forgotten in her excitement. "When can we see it?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. It's about 10 miles east of town." The land exceeded Willow's expectations. Nestled in a gentle valley with mountains rising in the distance, the small homestead offered everything they needed to begin fertile soil for crops, pasture for livestock, timber for building, and most precious of all, a clear spring feeding into a small creek. The cabin was crude but sturdy, built by the rancher's son who had since moved to California. It needed repairs and expansion, but Willow could already envision curtains at the windows and a garden plot beside the door. "What do you think?" Jack asked as they stood on a small rise overlooking the property. "Could you be happy here?" Willow turned to him, her heart full. "I could be happy anywhere with you, Jack Blackett, but yes, I could be very happy here." That evening, back at the boarding house, they finalized their plans over supper. They would travel to Denver the next day, spend a week with Willow's relatives, and return to complete the land purchase. If all went well, they could be settled before winter. "There's just one more thing," Jack said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, keeping it concealed in his palm. "I know this is fast. I know the proper way would be to court you for months, seek your family's blessing, do everything by the book." Willow's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "But nothing about our meeting has been conventional," Jack continued. "And I've learned that sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of taking things slow." He opened his hand to reveal a simple silver ring with a small pearl set in the center. "I saw this at the jeweler's in town today, made me think of your mare and how you named her for her spirit." "Seemed fitting." "Jack," Willow whispered, unable to say more past the emotion tightening her throat. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said softly. "I can't offer you luxury or an easy life. But I can promise to walk beside you through whatever comes, to build something lasting together, to never let you face this world alone again." He took a deep breath. "Willow Fairchild, will you marry me?" The simplicity of the question belied its profound impact. In that moment, Willow saw not just the man before her, but the future they could forge together, children running across their land, a home filled with laughter, years of partnership through hardship and joy alike. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Blackett." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, and as their lips met in a tender kiss, Willow knew with absolute certainty that her parents would have approved of this match. She had found not just a companion but a partner, someone who understood what it meant to build something from nothing, to face the wilderness with determination and hope. The journey to Denver took them through increasingly settled territory, the wild frontier giving way to farms and small communities. They arrived at her aunt and uncle's comfortable home on the outskirts of the growing city on a warm afternoon in mid-July. The reunion was emotional, with her mother's sister embracing Willow through tears of both grief for her lost sibling and joy at finding her niece safe. To Willow's relief, her relatives welcomed Jack warmly, especially after hearing the story of their meeting and journey. "You saved our Willow when she needed it most," her Uncle Thomas said, shaking Jack's hand firmly. "That makes you family already in our eyes." The week in Denver passed quickly, filled with preparations and planning. Willow's aunt insisted on helping with a proper wedding dress, while her uncle offered practical advice about establishing their homestead. When Willow explained their plans to Mary before returning to Fort Collins, her relatives offered to host a small ceremony in their garden. "Nothing fancy," her Aunt Margaret said, "but proper all the same. Your parents would want that for you, dear." And so, just 10 days after arriving in Denver, Willow stood in her aunt's garden wearing a simple white dress with blue ribbons, a crown of wildflowers in her hair. Jack waited beneath an arch of roses, looking both nervous and completely certain, dressed in new clothes that her uncle had insisted on providing as a wedding gift. The local minister spoke of new beginnings and God's grace in bringing people together through unexpected circumstances. As they exchanged vows, Willow thought of how far she had come from that desperate evening when she had cried out her loneliness to the empty Colorado sky. "I promise to walk beside you," Jack vowed, his voice steady as he placed a simple gold band on her finger to accompany her engagement ring. "Through whatever storms may come, whatever joys we may find, whatever challenges we may face, you will never walk alone again." "And I promise to walk beside you," Willow responded, sliding a matching band onto his finger. "To build our home not just of timber and stone but of love and trust. To face each day knowing that together we are stronger than either of us alone." As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Willow felt the final pieces of her shattered world realigning into something new and beautiful. The grief remained it always would, but now it existed alongside hope, purpose, and a love she had never expected to find. Their return to Fort Collins as husband and wife marked the beginning of their shared life. The land purchase completed, they set about transforming the small cabin into a home while preparing for their first winter together. Jack's skills as a carpenter proved invaluable as they added a proper bedroom and enlarged the main living area. Willow planted a late kitchen garden and began putting up preserves from wild berries they gathered. Neighbors from nearby homesteads came to welcome them, bringing gifts of seeds, cuttings, and practical household items. In this frontier community, new settlers were welcomed with generosity born of the knowledge that survival depended on mutual support. By October, with the aspens turning gold and the first frost threatening, they had transformed the rough cabin into a cozy home. A proper stone chimney replaced the crude fireplace, glass windows let in light while keeping out the cold, and Willow's blue calico curtains added a touch of beauty to the practical space. On their 3-month anniversary, Jack surprised Willow with a final addition, a covered porch facing the sunset, complete with 2 rocking chairs set side by side. "For when we're old and gray," he explained as he led her outside to see his handiwork. "So we can watch our grandchildren play while we rock together." Tears filled Willow's eyes as she took in the simple perfection of his gift. "It's beautiful, Jack." They sat together as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, hands intertwined, watching as deer emerged cautiously from the forest edge to drink at their creek. "Are you happy?" Jack asked softly, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern on her palm. Willow considered the question seriously. Her journey had been marked by unimaginable loss but also by unexpected blessings. The pain of her parents' death would never fully heal, but alongside it now grew a life filled with purpose and love. "Profoundly," she answered honestly. "I never imagined when I stood alone that night that my cry of despair would lead to this. That the stranger who answered would become my husband, my partner, my home." Jack raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Not a stranger anymore." "No," Willow agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Not a stranger, my companion on the journey." As night fell completely, bringing with it the familiar chorus of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes, they remained on their porch, planning the spring planting, discussing the livestock they hoped to acquire, dreaming of the family they might build in this place they now called home. The wilderness that had once seemed so threatening now enveloped them like a protective embrace, a canvas upon which they would paint their shared future one day at a time. For Willow, who had once walked alone in grief, and for Jack, who had wandered in solitude since the war, the path ahead now stretched before them not as a solitary trail, but as a road traveled side by side, hand in hand, hearts beating in unison beneath the vast Colorado sky.